What if the gods of ancient myth were not imaginary but memories, distorted by time, of beings who once walked the earth and then vanished? Who were the Anunnaki of Sumeria and the Watchers of Hebrew Scripture? Sky beings said to have descended before the Great Flood to teach humanity the secrets of civilization. And why do their stories appear in cultures separated by oceans and millennia? Tonight, we trace the evidence carved in cuneiform tablets and monumental stones, following a thread that connects Mesopotamian temples to Andean platforms, Egyptian pyramids to Turkish megaliths, all whispering of a time when humanity was not alone. Welcome to Whispered Empires, where forgotten histories rise from dust and silence. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, reflect, or simply wonder at the mysteries beneath our familiar world, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let us begin in the desert of southern Iraq, where the first city rose from nothing and the gods, so the texts say, walked among mortals. The ruins of Eridu lie beneath the Iraqi sun, half buried in sand, silent except for the wind that moves across broken walls and empty courtyards. This place, according to Sumerian tradition, was the first city on earth, the spot where kingship descended from heaven after the world was made. Modern archaeology confirms Eridu's antiquity. Settlements here date to at least 5400 BC, perhaps earlier, making it among the oldest urban sites ever discovered. But the Sumerians claimed something stranger. They said Eridu was founded not by human hands alone but under the guidance of the Anunnaki, beings who came from the sky, who taught the arts of civilization, who ruled as gods and kings before the Great Flood swept the world clean. Stand here among the ruins, and you face a question that has haunted scholars, mystics, and skeptics for over a century. Were the Anunnaki mythological inventions, symbolic representations of natural forces or human rulers? Or were they something else, visitors, teachers, entities whose presence shaped the birth of human civilization and whose departure left a wound in collective memory that we filled with stories? The stones remember, even when the texts are ambiguous. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts, usually translated as those who from heaven to earth came, though the etymology is debated. In the earliest Sumerian records, the Anunnaki are a pantheon of deities associated with the earth and underworld, contrasted with the Igigi celestial gods who served them. The texts describe the Anunnaki as judges, administrators, and creators, beings who shaped humanity from clay and divine essence to serve as workers, tending the earth and honoring the gods. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation epic, the Atrahasis flood narrative, all reference the Anunnaki as active participants in human affairs, not distant abstractions but hands-on rulers who walked among mortals, who took human lovers, who convened in councils to decide the fate of civilizations. By the time these stories were written down in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, they were already ancient, passed through generations as oral tradition before being pressed into clay tablets. How much did the stories change in transmission, and how much do they preserve of something older? The motif of sky beings descending to guide or rule humanity is not unique to Mesopotamia. In the Hebrew Book of Enoch, dated to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC but claiming to record antediluvian events, the Watchers are angels who left their heavenly posts, descended to Mount Hermon, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, the secrets of roots and plants. They took human wives, producing the Nephilim, giants whose violence corrupted the earth and provoked divine judgment in the form of the flood. In Egyptian tradition, the Neteru, often translated as gods, were said to have ruled Egypt in a golden age before the pharaohs, a time remembered in the Turin Papyrus and Manethos histories as the reign of the gods. In the Andes, the Tiwanaku people told of Viracocha, a bearded sky god who emerged from Lake Titicaca after a great flood, taught the survivors the arts of civilization, then departed across the sea. The names differ, the details vary, but the structure repeats. Sky beings arrive, teach, intervene, then leave. Why does this pattern appear across cultures that had no known contact? The Sumerian King List, a cuneiform text compiled around 2100 BC from older sources, provides a chronology that challenges conventional history. It begins with the line, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." It names 8 kings who ruled before the flood, each reigning for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the list continues, the kingship was lowered again from heaven, and new dynasties rose in cities like Kish and Uruk, but the reigns shortened to more plausible human lifespans. Mainstream scholars interpret the antediluvian kings as mythological, the exaggerated reigns as symbolic or the result of misunderstood sexagesimal mathematics. Yet the text treats them as historical, presenting pre-flood and post-flood rulers in the same matter-of-fact tone, as if the only difference was chronological, not ontological. If we take the king list seriously as a form of memory, distorted but rooted in experience, what does it tell us? That something changed after the flood. That kingship, whatever that meant, came from somewhere else before being established on earth. That the beings who ruled before the deluge were different in nature, in lifespan, in origin from those who came after. We are left with fragments, texts that insist on the reality of the Anunnaki, archaeological sites that confirm the antiquity of the cities they supposedly founded, but no physical evidence of the beings themselves. No skeletons, no artifacts unambiguously alien or divine. Nothing that proves beyond doubt that non-human intelligences once walked among early Sumerians. Does this absence disprove the accounts, or does it simply mean we are looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions? Mythology, we are taught, is fiction, symbolic truth but not factual. Yet every myth begins somewhere, and the most persistent myths often have roots in historical events, wars, migrations, natural disasters, remembered across generations until the details blur and the protagonists become gods. Could the Anunnaki be such a memory, a recollection of teachers or rulers who were so advanced, so different from the surrounding populations, that they were understood as divine? The stones of Eridu offer no answer, but they hold the question. In the next chapter, we descend into the cuneiform tablets themselves, reading the texts that name the Anunnaki and describe their deeds, searching for clues to their nature and the cataclysm that ended their rule. Cuneiform is among the oldest writing systems on Earth. Wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay by Sumerian scribes beginning around 3200 BC. The tablets that survive, baked hard by fire or sun, preserve everything from administrative records and legal contracts to epic poetry and cosmological treatises. Among these texts are the creation myths and king lists that describe the Anunnaki in vivid, troubling detail. They are not abstract deities worshipped from afar but active agents, beings who dig canals, breed livestock, convene assemblies, argue among themselves, and intervene in human affairs. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BC, describes the Anunnaki toiling to dig the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, growing weary of the labor and rebelling. To solve the problem, the god Enki proposes creating humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, beings intelligent enough to work but subservient enough to obey. Humanity, in this account, is engineered, not born of natural evolution but designed by the Anunnaki to fulfill a function. The text treats this as history, not allegory. Should we? The Enuma Elish, The Babylonian creation epic, recorded in the 7th century BC but drawing on older Sumerian sources, describes a cosmos born from conflict. Tiamat, the primordial ocean, battles Marduk, the champion of the younger gods. Marduk slays Tiamat, splits her body to form heaven and earth, and establishes order from chaos. The Anunnaki appear as Marduk's council, 50 great gods who help govern the newly organized universe. After creation, Marduk commands that humans be fashioned to serve the gods, freeing the Anunnaki from manual labor. The epic does not shy from depicting the gods as hierarchical, political, even petty, squabbling over rank and privilege. This portrayal is strikingly different from later monotheistic traditions where divinity is transcendent, beyond human flaws. The Anunnaki, as the Sumerians and Babylonians describe them, are powerful but not omnipotent, long-lived but not eternal, wise but capable of error. They resemble an advanced civilization more than they resemble the God of Abraham. Does this make them more believable or less? Other ancient cultures describe pantheons with similar characteristics. The Greek Olympians, led by Zeus, are immortal but not invincible, subject to passions, rivalries, and limitations. They intervene in human affairs, take mortal lovers, produce demigod offspring, and occasionally face challenges from titans or giants. The Norse Aesir, dwelling in Asgard, are destined to die at Ragnarok, their immortality conditional rather than absolute. The Hindu Devas, dwelling in celestial realms, engage in politics, warfare, and alliances, their power immense but bounded by cosmic law. In each tradition, the gods are more like superhuman beings than omnipotent creators, and in each tradition, these beings interact directly with humanity, shaping cultures, teaching skills, and producing hybrid offspring. The parallels suggest either independent invention of similar mythic structures, which is possible, or a shared underlying memory, a pattern so old it predates the divergence of these cultures. If the latter, what event or reality gave rise to the pattern? The city of Nippur, located in central Mesopotamia, served as a religious capital for Sumer and later empires. Excavations there have uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets, many cataloging temple inventories, rituals, and hymns to the gods. Among these texts are references to the Eker, the mountain house, a ziggurat dedicated to Enlil, chief of the Anunnaki. The Eker was not merely symbolic. It was understood as the actual dwelling place of the god, the point where heaven and earth touched. Offerings were brought, rituals performed, and scribes recorded communications from the deity in the form of omens and divinations. The Sumerians did not treat the Anunnaki as metaphors. They built infrastructure around them, allocated resources to feed and house them, recorded their commands in legal and administrative texts. This level of institutional investment suggests sincere belief, but belief in what? In imaginary beings whose favor was sought through ritual, or in entities whose presence was experienced directly, whose instructions carried tangible consequences. The Great Flood marks the dividing line in Mesopotamian tradition. Before the flood, the Anunnaki ruled openly, their presence undisputed. After the flood, they withdrew, their involvement indirect, mediated through human kings and priests. The Sumerian flood story, preserved in the tale of Ziusudra, describes the gods convening in secret to decide humanity's fate. One god, Enki, warns Ziusudra to build a boat and survive. The flood comes, lasting 7 days and nights, and when it recedes, Ziusudra offers sacrifice. The gods, having realized the value of humanity, grant him eternal life and relocate him to Dilmun, a paradise beyond mortal reach. The Akkadian version, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells the same story through Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who explains to Gilgamesh that immortality is no longer offered to mortals, that the age of direct divine interaction has ended. What changed? Did the flood represent a natural catastrophe that decimated populations and destroyed records, allowing myth to fill the gaps? Or did it mark a deliberate departure, the Anunnaki withdrawing from Earth after witnessing the consequences of their intervention? The stones remember, but the answer is submerged beneath layers of reinterpretation. In the next chapter, we turn to the Hebrew tradition and the Watchers, asking whether these fallen angels are the same beings the Sumerians called Anunnaki. Mount Hermon rises on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, its peaks snow-capped even in summer, visible for miles across the surrounding valleys. In the Book of Enoch, a Jewish apocalyptic text preserved in Ethiopic and Aramaic fragments, this mountain is named as the landing place of the Watchers. 200 angels who descended from heaven swore an oath binding themselves to their mission and walked among humanity as teachers and lovers. The text, attributed to Enoch, the seventh patriarch who walked with God and was taken without tasting death, describes the Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge, the forging of weapons and ornaments, the use of cosmetics and dyes, the observation of stars, and the secrets of sorcery. They took human wives, and from these unions came the Nephilim, giants whose appetites consumed the resources of the earth and whose violence provoked divine wrath. The parallels to the Anunnaki are striking. Both are celestial beings who descend, both teach advanced knowledge, both produce hybrid offspring, both are judged and removed after their intervention spirals into chaos. Are these parallel myths, independent creations addressing similar human anxieties? Or are they two tellings of the same story, preserved by cultures separated by geography and centuries? The Book of Enoch was not included in the Hebrew Bible canon, though it was highly influential in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. Fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the book is quoted in the New Testament Epistle of Jude, lending it scriptural weight in some traditions. The text describes the Watchers by name: Semyaza the leader, Azazel the teacher of weaponry, Armoros who taught counterspells, Barakel who taught astrology, and dozens more, each with a specific domain of forbidden knowledge. The names are Semitic, rooted in Hebrew and Aramaic, yet the structure of the narrative, divine beings descending, interbreeding, teaching, then being judged, mirrors Sumerian accounts written over a millennium earlier. Did the Jewish authors of Enoch draw on Mesopotamian traditions they encountered during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC? Or do both traditions draw on an older, shared source, a memory that predates writing itself? The question is complicated by the fact that Enoch, as a figure, appears in Genesis without detail, a placeholder patriarch who lived 365 years and was taken by God. His elaboration into a celestial scribe who witnessed the fall of angels suggests a need to explain something, to preserve a story that the canonical texts only hinted at. The Nephilim, the offspring of Watchers and human women, appear briefly in Genesis 6, described as mighty men of old, men of renown. Later Jewish traditions elaborate, portraying them as giants of immense size and strength, whose violence and corruption necessitated the flood. Numbers 13 mentions Nephilim again, encountered by Israelite spies in Canaan, suggesting they survived the deluge or re-emerged afterward. The Greek Septuagint translates Nephilim as gigantes, from which our word giants derives. Other ancient cultures preserve similar stories of hybrid beings born from gods and mortals. Greek mythology is filled with demigods, heroes like Hercules, Perseus, and Achilles, whose divine parentage grants them superhuman abilities but not immortality. Norse tradition speaks of Jotnar, often translated as giants, beings of immense power who predate and oppose the Asur gods. Hindu epics describe Asuras and Rakshasas, powerful beings born of divine or semi-divine lineage, who challenge the order of the cosmos. The pattern of divine-human hybrids producing exceptional, often troublesome offspring recurs across mythologies. Is this an archetypal narrative, a psychological projection of human ambition and transgression, or a memory of something that once occurred, interbreeding between two populations that left descendants whose difference was remembered as monstrosity? The judgment of the Watchers is detailed extensively in the Book of Enoch. God sends archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel to bind the Watchers in darkness until the final judgment, to destroy the Nephilim, and to cleanse the earth through the flood. Enoch himself is summoned to deliver the verdict, to tell the Watchers that their intercession on behalf of humanity is rejected, that they will witness the destruction of their offspring and remain imprisoned until the end of days. The punishment is harsh but not annihilation. The Watchers are bound, not destroyed, suggesting their story is not finished, only paused. The flood, in this telling, is not arbitrary divine anger but a targeted response to contamination, a resetting of conditions to remove the hybrid population and restore humanity to its original unmixed state. This framing raises uncomfortable questions. If the Watchers were real, if their offspring were real, what happened to their genetic legacy? Did the flood truly erase them, or do traces persist, remembered in myths of heroes and giants, in skeletal anomalies occasionally unearthed and dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications? The text offers no easy answers, only the insistence that something happened, something that required divine intervention on a planetary scale to correct. The Watchers and the Anunnaki share too many details to be entirely unrelated. Both descend from the sky or heaven, both interact directly with humanity, both teach advanced knowledge that proves destabilizing, both produce hybrid offspring, both are associated with a great flood that ends their open presence on Earth. The differences are largely contextual. Sumerian texts frame the Anunnaki as creators and rulers, Jewish texts frame the Watchers as rebels and corruptors. But both traditions agree on the essential arc: descent, intervention, judgment, withdrawal. If these are memories rather than inventions, then the flood, whenever and however it occurred, marks the turning point, the moment when direct contact ended and humanity was left to develop alone, or at least without the same level of oversight. The myths, in this reading, are not fantasies but distorted histories, accounts of contact preserved by cultures that had no framework to explain what they experienced except through the language of gods and angels. The stones remember, but do we have the courage to read what they say? In the next chapter, we widen the lens, examining how myths of sky teachers appear in cultures across the globe, from the Americas to the Pacific, asking whether independent invention or diffusion can explain the pattern, or whether something else is required. If the Anunnaki and Watchers were isolated myths, products of Mesopotamian and Hebrew imagination, we might dismiss them as local folklore. But they are not isolated. From the steppes of Central Asia to the jungles of Mesoamerica, from the highlands of the Andes to the islands of Polynesia, cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell stories of beings who came from the sky, taught the fundamentals of civilization, and then departed, often after a great catastrophe. The Dogon people of Mali speak of the Namo, amphibious beings who descended from the star Sirius and brought knowledge of astronomy and agriculture. The Hopi of North America preserve legends of the Kachinas, spirit beings who taught the ancestors and will return in times of great need. In Peru, the Inca and pre-Inca cultures revered Viracocha, a bearded god king who emerged after a flood, taught the survivors, then walked across the ocean and disappeared. In ancient India, the Vedas describe the Devas and the Rishis, divine or semi-divine sages who transmitted sacred knowledge to humanity. The details differ, but the structure persists. Who were these teachers and why do they vanish? The Apkallu of Mesopotamian tradition provide a bridge between divine and human. These are not the Anunnaki themselves but sages, 7 wise beings sent by the god Ea before the flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization, how to build cities, dig canals, establish laws, perform rituals. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BC, describes the first Apkallu, Oannes, as a creature who emerged from the Persian Gulf, part man and part fish, who taught the Babylonians writing, agriculture, and the founding of temples. Oannes returned to the sea each night, and after him came 6 more sages, each contributing to human knowledge. The Apkallu are depicted in Assyrian art as human-like figures with fish cloaks or bird wings, intermediaries between gods and mortals. After the flood, the tradition shifts. The post-Diluvian Apkallu are described as partly human, hybrids or successors who carry forward the teachings but lack the full authority and presence of their predecessors. The flood, once again, marks the break. Before it, direct transmission from non-human teachers. After it, human priests and kings claiming descent or inspiration from those teachers but no longer encountering them directly. In the Andes, long before the Inca, the Tiwanaku culture flourished near Lake Titicaca, building massive stone platforms and megalithic gateways at altitudes where agriculture barely supports life. Tiwanaku's origins are debated, with some sites dated to 1500 BC or earlier. Local legends, recorded by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, describe Viracocha appearing at Lake Titicaca after a great flood destroyed the previous world. He raised the sun and moon, created new people from stone, and traveled across the land teaching the arts of civilization. He is described as tall, bearded, and light-skinned, features anomalous among indigenous Andean populations. After completing his work, Viracocha walked westward into the Pacific and vanished, promising to return. The parallels to other flood and teacher myths are obvious, but the chronology is striking. If Tiwanaku's megalithic construction began in the 2nd millennium BC or earlier, it aligns roughly with the Late Bronze Age in the Near East, the period when Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations were consolidating. Could there have been contact, diffusion of knowledge, or populations across continents? Or does the pattern emerge independently because it reflects a real event, sky teachers appearing in multiple locations during the same epoch? The megalithic sites themselves whisper of knowledge beyond what we expect from the cultures that built them. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to around 9600 BC, consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars carved with animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures, arranged in circular enclosures and then deliberately buried. The site predates agriculture, pottery, and metallurgy in the region, yet it required organization, planning, and techniques to quarry, transport, and erect stones weighing up to 20 tons. Who taught the builders? Conventional archaeology suggests a surprisingly advanced hunter-gatherer society, but the scale and sophistication challenge that model. Some researchers propose that Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of an earlier, more advanced culture displaced by the Younger Dryas climate shift, a sudden cooling period around 10,800 BC that disrupted global populations. Others suggest it was a gathering place for scattered groups who pooled knowledge and labor. But the carvings, the symbolism, the astronomical alignments some claim to detect hint at a teaching tradition, knowledge passed down or imported from elsewhere. Could the builders have been guided by the same sky teachers remembered in later Mesopotamian and Hebrew texts? The question of independent invention versus diffusion has divided anthropologists for over a century. Can we explain the global distribution of flood myths, sky teacher legends, and megalithic construction as parallel evolution, human cultures independently developing similar stories and techniques in response to similar environmental pressures? Or must we invoke contact, whether through migration, trade, or the intervention of a third party, a teacher culture that visited multiple regions and left similar marks? The evidence leans toward the former in many cases, cultural universals arising from shared human psychology and experience. But the specifics, the names, the timelines, the technological anomalies, resist easy explanation. The sky teachers, whether Anunnaki, Watchers, Apkallu, Viracocha, or Namo, share too many characteristics to be entirely coincidental. Either humanity is hardwired to invent this particular narrative, or the narrative is rooted in events that multiple cultures witnessed and remembered, each in their own language and symbolic framework. The stones remember, the myths persist, but certainty eludes us. In the next chapter, we focus on Göbekli Tepe, the site that has rewritten our understanding of early human capability and that may hold clues to the identity of those who taught the first temple builders. Göbekli Tepe sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, overlooking the Fertile Crescent, the region where agriculture is said to have been born. For millennia, the site lay hidden beneath dirt and time, mistaken for a natural formation. Then in 1994, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt recognized worked stone beneath the surface and began excavations that would challenge every assumption about the transition from hunter-gatherers to settled civilizations. The structures uncovered are older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids by 7,000, older than writing, pottery, and the wheel. Massive T-shaped pillars, some over 18 feet tall and weighing 20 tons, are arranged in circular enclosures, their surfaces carved with reliefs of lions, foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and abstract symbols that defy interpretation. The site dates to approximately 9,600 BC, the end of the Younger Dryas, a time when humans are supposed to have been nomadic foragers, not master architects. Yet here it stands, undeniable, demanding explanation. Who built Göbekli Tepe and who taught them? The conventional explanation is that Göbekli Tepe represents a previously unknown level of sophistication among Paleolithic societies. Schmidt himself proposed that the site was a ritual center, a temple built by hunter-gatherer groups who gathered seasonally to worship, feast, and collaborate. The effort of construction, he suggested, may have driven the development of agriculture, as feeding large labor forces over extended periods required reliable food sources, leading to the domestication of wheat and barley in the surrounding region. This theory, called the temple before agriculture hypothesis, inverts the traditional narrative that religion and monumental architecture follow settled farming. It is elegant, supported by evidence of wild grain use at the site, and fits the archaeological data. Yet it raises as many questions as it answers. How did scattered bands of foragers, living at subsistence level, organize the labor to quarry, transport, and erect pillars weighing tons? Where did the knowledge of masonry, carving, and symbolic representation come from, fully formed, with no apparent developmental phase? Some researchers, particularly those exploring alternative histories, propose that Göbekli Tepe was not built by the local population alone, but with guidance from survivors of an earlier, more advanced culture. The end of the Younger Dryas, around 9600 BC, was marked by rapid climate warming, rising sea levels, and widespread ecological disruption. If a coastal or lowland civilization existed before this period, Its cities and records would now lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean or buried under sediment. Survivors, displaced by rising waters, could have migrated inland, bringing architectural and astronomical knowledge to less developed populations. Göbekli Tepe, in this reading, is a refuge project, a deliberate preservation of knowledge in stone, built to endure the ages and convey a message to future generations. The site's pillars, some scholars suggest, may encode astronomical data, mapping constellations or marking celestial events. If true, the builders possessed observational astronomy at a level not supposed to exist for thousands of years. The question becomes, did they develop this knowledge independently, or were they taught? The carvings on Göbekli Tepe's pillars include humanoid figures, some with arms bent at their sides, others depicted without heads or with fox pelts draped over their shoulders. One pillar, known as the vulture stone, shows a bird hovering over a headless human, surrounded by symbols that some interpret as a comet or celestial impact. Researcher Martin Sweatman, analyzing the iconography, has proposed that the vulture stone commemorates a cometary impact event around 10,900 BC, the trigger for the Younger Dryas cooling. If correct, the stone is both a historical record and a warning, evidence that the builders understood catastrophe and sought to preserve the memory. Other pillars display animals in procession, arrangements that may correspond to zodiacal constellations or totemic symbols. The meaning remains contested, but the intent is clear. This was not casual decoration. It was communication, a message encoded in stone for those who could read it. Who was the intended audience? Future generations of the same culture or something else expected to return and recognize the signs? Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned through decay or conquest. It was deliberately buried. Around 800 BC, the circular enclosures were filled with rubble and soil, the pillars carefully covered, the site entombed as if it were too sacred or too dangerous to remain exposed. Why would a people invest generations in building a temple only to bury it? Schmidt suggested it was ritual closure, a ceremonial end to one phase of use before moving on. But the deliberate nature of the burial, the effort required to fill the enclosures, suggests something more. Perhaps the knowledge it represented became forbidden, the teachers who inspired it having departed or fallen from favor. Perhaps later inhabitants feared what the site symbolized, a connection to the sky beings whose intervention had brought both gifts and catastrophe. The stones remember, but their memory is locked beneath tons of earth, and only a fraction of the site has been excavated. What lies deeper, in the layers not yet reached? More enclosures, more pillars, perhaps even inscriptions or artifacts that would clarify the builder's identity and inspiration. The mystery endures, and in the next chapter, we turn to the event that the myths insist ended the age of sky teachers, the great flood that drowned the world and forced humanity to begin again, this time without their guides. Water is the element of both life and erasure. It nourishes and it destroys, filling valleys and carving canyons, sustaining cities and swallowing them whole. The Great Flood appears in over 200 cultures worldwide, from Australia to the Arctic, from Africa to the Americas. The details vary, but the core narrative is constant. The world becomes corrupt, violent, or imbalanced. A deity or deities decide to cleanse it. Water rises, covering mountains, drowning all but a chosen few who survive in boats or on high peaks. When the waters recede, the survivors repopulate the earth, and the old world, the antediluvian age, becomes myth. Is this convergence coincidence, cultures independently inventing a flood story to explain geological features like seashells on mountaintops? Or does it point to a real event, a global or near-global inundation that traumatized humanity so deeply that the memory persisted across every subsequent civilization? The question is not merely academic. If the flood was real, it marks the boundary between two worlds, the age when the Anunnaki and Watchers walked openly and the age when humanity was alone. The Mesopotamian flood narratives are the oldest written accounts. The Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, dated to around 1600 BC but based on earlier oral traditions, describes the gods convening in secret to destroy humanity with a deluge. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, warns Ziusudra, a pious king, to build a boat and load it with animals and seeds. The flood lasts 7 days and nights. Ziusudra survives, offers sacrifice, and is granted immortality, relocated to Dilmun, a paradise beyond mortal reach. The Akkadian version, known from the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells the same story through Utnapishtim. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise and overpopulation, send the flood. Equivalent to Enki, warns Utnapishtim in a dream. The boat is massive, a cube or rectangle, coated with bitumen, loaded with family, animals, and craftsmen. The flood is more violent in this telling, lasting longer, the gods themselves frightened by its intensity, lamenting their decision. When Utnapishtim emerges, the gods realize they need humanity and grant him eternal life as compensation. The narrative is vivid, specific, treating the flood as historical event, not parable. The Hebrew account in Genesis 6 through 9 parallels the Mesopotamian versions closely. Noah, a righteous man in a corrupt generation, is instructed by God to build an ark, exact dimensions given, and to load it with his family and pairs of animals. The flood, caused by 40 days and nights of rain and the breaking of subterranean fountains, covers the earth for 150 days. The ark lands on the mountains of Ararat. Noah sends out a raven and then a dove to test for dry land. When they emerge, God makes a covenant never to flood the earth again, sealing it with the rainbow. The similarities to the Mesopotamian accounts suggest either direct borrowing, likely during the Babylonian exile when Jewish scribes encountered Akkadian texts, or a shared older source. The differences are theological. The Hebrew version emphasizes monotheism and moral judgment. The Mesopotamian versions portray quarreling gods who act impulsively and regret. But both agree on the core facts: a flood, a boat, a survivor, a restart. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. Flood myths appear in cultures that had no known contact with the Near East. The Maori of New Zealand tell of Tawaki, a hero who ascends to the heavens and whose descendants survive a great deluge. The Aztecs preserve the legend of the fourth sun, an age that ended when the sky rained fire and water, and only one couple survived in a hollow log. The Algonquin nations of North America speak of a great flood from which Nanabozo, a trickster creator figure, saves animals by building a raft. Hindu texts describe Manu, warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu, building a boat to survive a flood that destroys the world, after which he becomes the progenitor of the new human race. Chinese mythology includes Gun Yu, a flood hero who controls the waters and establishes order. Australian Aboriginal stories, some of the oldest continuous oral traditions on Earth, include flood narratives where the land was inundated and ancestors survived by climbing trees or mountains. The geographic spread is total. Either every culture independently invented this story, or they are all remembering the same event. Geological evidence offers partial support for a catastrophic flood, or rather multiple regional floods, at the end of the last ice age. Around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas cold period ended abruptly, triggering rapid warming, the collapse of ice sheets, and a global sea level rise of over 300 feet across several millennia. Coastal regions where humans had settled were inundated, entire ecosystems drowned, and populations displaced. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, proposed by geologists Ryan and Pittman, suggests that around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean breached a natural dam and flooded the Black Sea basin, a freshwater lake, turning it into a saltwater sea and drowning settlements around its shores. This event, sudden and catastrophic for those living there, could have seeded flood myths throughout the Near East and beyond as survivors migrated and carried their stories. But this does not account for the global distribution of flood narratives, unless we accept that similar inundations occurred on every inhabited continent as sea levels rose. The stones remember the water, but they do not tell us why the myths insist the flood was divine judgment, a deliberate act to end an age. What was being judged and who passed sentence? In the next chapter, we examine the monuments left behind, asking whether the precision and scale of ancient megalithic construction suggests human achievement alone or the lingering influence of the sky teachers before they departed. Stone outlasts flesh, memory, and empire. The monuments that survive the millennia, the pyramids of Giza, the platforms of Tiwanaku, the submerged structures off the coasts of Japan and India, speak of capabilities that challenge our understanding of ancient technology. The Great Pyramid, built supposedly around 2560 BC, is aligned to true north within 3/60ths of a degree, its base level to within 1 inch across 13 acres, its blocks fitted so precisely that a blade cannot pass between them. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, constructed by the Inca or pre-Inca cultures, feature stones weighing over 100 tons, cut with interlocking joints of such complexity that modern engineers struggle to explain how they were shaped and placed without metal tools, cranes, or wheeled transport. Baalbek in Lebanon includes foundation stones, the trilithon, each weighing approximately 800 tons, moved from a quarry half a mile away and incorporated into a Roman temple built atop much older, unexplained stonework. The precision, the scale, the effort required all invite the question: were these monuments built by the cultures that claimed them, or were they inherited, restored, or completed with guidance from those who came before? Mainstream archaeology credits human ingenuity, organization, and labor. The Egyptians, we are told, used copper tools, wooden sledges, and enormous ramps to construct the pyramids over 20 years, employing tens of thousands of workers fed and housed by a centralized state. The Inca, working with bronze tools and andesite hammers, shaped the stones of Sacsayhuaman through patient percussion and abrasion, fitting them by trial and error across generations. The techniques are plausible, demonstrated in experimental archaeology, and the organizational capacity of Bronze Age and later states is well attested. Yet anomalies persist. No traces of the massive ramps required to build the Great Pyramid have been found, and the internal passages show precision machining, drill marks, and saw cuts in granite that suggest tools harder and more efficient than copper or bronze. At Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia, stones display evidence of modular construction, standardized cuts, and metal clamps, implying prefabrication and industrial scale planning. The Antikythera mechanism, a Greek device dated to around 100 BC, is an analog computer tracking astronomical cycles with gear work so sophisticated it was not matched until the 14th century. Knowledge, it seems, is not always cumulative. Sometimes it appears, flourishes, and is lost. The alignments encoded in these structures deepen the mystery. The pyramids of Giza are aligned to the cardinal directions with precision that requires advanced surveying and astronomical observation. Their layout, some researchers argue, mirrors the constellation Orion, specifically the three stars of Orion's belt, as they appeared around 10,500 BC during the last precessional age. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point toward specific stars, Sirius and Orion, as they would have been positioned around 2500 BC. Stonehenge in England, constructed in phases between 3000 and 2000 BC, aligns to the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset, serving as both calendar and ceremonial center. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, built in the 12th century AD, mirrors the constellation Draco as it appeared at the spring equinox around 10,500 BC, according to some interpretations. The recurring date, 10,500 BC, is tantalizing. It falls at the end of the Younger Dryas, the climatic boundary that reshaped the world. Could these alignments be signatures, deliberate markers left by a culture that witnessed that age and encoded the memory in stone for those who would come after? Underwater archaeology adds another layer. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, submerged stone structures, possibly terraces, steps, and platforms, lie beneath 80 feet of water. Mainstream geologists suggest they are natural formations, eroded bedrock, but others point to right angles, flat surfaces, and apparent tool marks as evidence of human shaping. If artificial, the structures would have been above sea level during the last ice age, before 10,000 BC. Similarly, the submerged city of Dwarka off the coast of Gujarat, India, mentioned in Hindu texts as the capital of Krishna, has yielded stone structures and artifacts dated to around 7500 BC, far older than the conventional dates for urban development in the region. The Gulf of Cambay, also off India's coast, has sonar images showing grid-like patterns and rectilinear features under 120 feet of water, suggesting planned settlement. If these sites are genuine, they imply that complex societies existed before the flood, literally, and that rising sea levels erased them from history, leaving only myths and submerged ruins. Could these have been the civilizations guided by the Anunnaki or Watchers, the cultures that disappeared when the waters rose? The monuments, whether on land or beneath the sea, suggest a level of knowledge that appears suddenly in the archaeological record, without obvious developmental phases. Pyramids do not begin as crude piles and evolve into precision structures. They appear in Egypt and Mesoamerica, fully realized, as if the knowledge of their construction was imported or taught rather than gradually discovered. The same is true for megalithic masonry, astronomical observation, and hydraulic engineering. Either we are missing earlier phases buried or destroyed, or the knowledge came from somewhere else, from a predecessor culture now lost, or from the sky teachers remembered in myth. The stones do not offer names or dates. They offer precision, alignment, and scale, evidence of intention and capability that demands explanation. In the next chapter, we turn to the knowledge itself, the astronomical tables, medical texts, and metallurgical techniques that appear in early civilizations, asking whether they represent independent discovery or inherited wisdom from the antediluvian age. Knowledge is a current that flows through time, sometimes steady, sometimes interrupted, occasionally surging from unknown springs. In the earliest written records of Mesopotamia and Egypt, we find not the tentative gropings of primitive minds but sophisticated systems already in place. Sumerian astronomical texts from the 3rd millennium BC track the movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn with accuracy that requires generations of observation. Egyptian medical papyri, dated to around 1600 BC but claiming to copy texts from the Old Kingdom, describes surgical procedures, anatomical knowledge, and pharmacological treatments that rival practices from much later eras. Metallurgical techniques, the smelting of bronze, the working of iron, the alloying of electrum, appear suddenly in the archaeological record, without clear antecedents. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard answer is gradual accumulation, trial and error across centuries, oral traditions eventually committed to writing. But the texts themselves often claim they are transcriptions of older sources, gifts from the gods, teachings from the sages of before the flood. Could these claims be more than pious fiction? The Sumerian astronomical texts, particularly the Mul.Appen tablets, dated to around 1000 BC but compiling older observations, list stars, constellations, and planetary movements in systematic detail. They describe the heliacal rising of stars, the times when specific constellations appear on the horizon at dawn, and use this data to create a calendar that coordinates lunar months with the solar year. This level of precision requires not only careful observation but mathematical modeling, an understanding of cycles that span decades or longer. The Babylonians, inheriting Sumerian knowledge, refined these systems further, predicting eclipses, tracking planetary synodic periods, and developing arithmetic sequences to model celestial motions. Greek astronomers, encountering Babylonian texts, adapted their methods, leading eventually to the work of Ptolemy and the geocentric model that dominated Western astronomy for over a millennium. But the origin, the Sumerian observations, appears fully formed. Did they develop it independently over centuries we cannot trace, or did they inherit it from the Apkallu, the antediluvian sages who, according to their own traditions, brought knowledge from the gods? The Vedic texts of ancient India, particularly the Rig Veda, composed between 1500 and 1000 BC but preserving older oral traditions, contain hymns that reference astronomical phenomena, precession, eclipses, and planetary movements. The Vedanga Jyotisha, an astronomical appendix to the Vedas, describes a calendar system based on observations of solstices and equinoxes. Some researchers suggest the Vedic texts encode knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle caused by Earth's axial wobble, a phenomenon not officially discovered until Greek astronomer Hipparchus identified it around 150 BC. If the Vedic hymns do contain precessional knowledge, they imply a continuity of observations spanning thousands of years, far longer than any known civilization. The Puranas, later Hindu texts, describe yugas, cosmic ages lasting millions of years, and cycles of creation and destruction that dwarf human history. While these may be symbolic or theological constructs, they suggest a framework for thinking in deep time, a perspective that sees human civilizations as transient phases in a much larger pattern. The Egyptian Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text dated to around 1600 BC, describes 48 surgical cases with remarkable anatomical precision. It identifies the brain as the center of motor control, describes the symptoms of spinal injuries, and outlines treatments for fractures, dislocations, and wounds. The text is pragmatic, eschewing magical incantations in favor of observation and physical intervention, a rational approach that seems centuries ahead of its time. The Ebers Papyrus, from the same period, lists over 700 remedies for various ailments, using plant, animal, and mineral substances, some of which modern pharmacology has validated. Both papyri claim to be copies of older texts, stretching back to the Old Kingdom or even the pre-dynastic period. If true, medical knowledge in Egypt was not accumulating but declining, the later scribes preserving fragments of a more sophisticated original. A similar pattern appears in Greek medicine. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, lived in the 5th century BC but his corpus draws on older Egyptian and Near Eastern sources, suggesting he was systematizing existing knowledge rather than inventing new principles. Could the advanced knowledge preserved in early texts be remnants of teachings from the Anunnaki or Watchers? The texts themselves say yes. The Sumerians credited the Apkallu with bringing civilization. The Book of Enoch credits the Watchers with teaching metallurgy, cosmetics, astronomy, and sorcery. The Vedas attribute knowledge to the rishis, divine sages who communicated directly with the gods. Egyptian tradition speaks of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, who gave humanity writing, mathematics, and medicine. Every tradition has its culture hero, its divine teacher, but the knowledge they impart is strikingly consistent: astronomy, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, law, medicine. These are the foundations of civilization. If humanity developed them independently, why do the myths insist they were gifts? Perhaps because they were not from gods in the supernatural sense, but from an advanced predecessor culture or external visitors whose intervention jump-started human development and whose departure left us to manage, and often lose, the knowledge they provided. The stones remember, and so do the texts, but the teachers themselves are gone. In the next chapter, we ask why. What happened to the Anunnaki after the flood, and why did they withdraw from direct involvement in human affairs? Disappearance is more haunting than presence. The Anunnaki, so active in Sumerian texts before the flood, recede after it, their role diminished, their interventions indirect. The post-Diluvian King Lists record mortal rulers with plausible lifespans, no more tens of thousands of years. The gods still exist in the mythology, receiving worship, issuing commands through oracles and omens, but they do not walk among humanity as they once did. The Watchers, according to the Book of Enoch, are bound in darkness, imprisoned until the final judgment, their offspring destroyed, their influence severed. The Apkallu, the sages who taught civilization, are replaced by human counselors and priests who claim to channel divine wisdom but no longer embody it. Every tradition that remembers the sky teachers also remembers their departure. The flood is the boundary. Before it, direct contact. After it, mediation through ritual, text, and memory. Why did they leave? And where did they go? Did they die in the flood, their technology and biology unable to survive the catastrophe? Did they withdraw voluntarily, judging their intervention a failure, humanity too violent or corrupt to be trusted with further knowledge? Or were they recalled, ordered by some higher authority to cease interfering in human development? Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe councils of the gods convened to decide humanity's fate. The Atrahasis epic portrays the gods as conflicted, some wishing to destroy humanity entirely, others arguing for mercy or pragmatic preservation. Enki, the god who warns Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, acts in defiance of the council's decision, his sympathy for humanity overriding his loyalty to the divine assembly. After the flood, the tone shifts. The gods realize they need humanity, not as servants but as partners, or at least as necessary components of the cosmic order. They lower kingship from heaven again, but this time it is conditional, earned, mediated. The kings are human, though some claim divine ancestry, and the gods' commands come through dreams, omens, and priestly interpretation rather than face-to-face dialogue. The intimacy is lost. The Enuma Elish, describing the post-flood order, frames humanity's role as maintaining the temples and performing rituals that sustain the gods, a transactional relationship rather than the direct oversight of the antediluvian age. Something changed permanently. The Greek myths preserve a similar pattern. The Titans, the elder gods who preceded the Olympians, are overthrown and imprisoned in Tartarus, a cosmic jail beneath the underworld. The Olympians, led by Zeus, rule the cosmos but do so from a distance, intervening in human affairs episodically rather than dwelling among mortals. The Age of Heroes, when gods and humans intermingled freely, producing demigods like Hercules and Perseus, fades into the Age of Men, when divine presence becomes rare, miraculous, a sign rather than a norm. By the classical period, the gods are abstractions, honored in ritual but not expected to appear. Norse mythology describes Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a future cataclysm in which the Aesir will die and the world will be destroyed and reborn. The Hindu cosmology cycles through yugas, ages in which the gods' presence waxes and wanes. The Satya Yuga, when gods and humans live together, giving way to the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and separation. The pattern is universal. The age of direct divine presence is always in the past, a golden age lost to catastrophe or cosmic transition. One interpretation, favored by rationalist scholars, is that the gods were never real, that they were projections, personifications of natural forces, psychological archetypes, or political constructs to legitimize ruling elites. The shift from direct presence to mediated worship reflects the maturation of human consciousness, the move from animistic or polytheistic thought to more abstract, monotheistic or philosophical systems. The Anunnaki and Watchers, in this view, were never physical beings but symbols, and their disappearance represents not an actual departure but a cultural evolution, humanity outgrowing the need for anthropomorphic deities. This explanation is coherent and aligns with much of anthropological theory. Yet it struggles to account for the specificity of the myths, the names, the genealogies, the technologies attributed to the teachers, and the global consistency of the flood and departure narrative. If the gods were purely symbolic, why do so many cultures independently create the same symbol structure? And why does it always include a catastrophe as the turning point? Another interpretation, more speculative but engaging with the texts on their own terms, is that the Anunnaki and Watchers were real, whether as advanced humans, survivors of a lost civilization, or non-human intelligences, and that they withdrew after the flood because their experiment with humanity had failed or reached a natural conclusion. The flood, whether a natural disaster or a deliberate reset, destroyed the hybrid populations, the Nephilim and their equivalents, and the surviving humans were left to develop on their own, carrying only fragmented memories and inherited knowledge. The sky teachers, in this reading, did not die but departed, returning to wherever they came from, the heavens in mythic language, perhaps another region, another dimension, or simply into hiding, observing from a distance but no longer intervening directly. The texts hint at this. The gods are not absent, they are remote. They watch, judge, occasionally inspire, but the age of walking among mortals has ended. The stones remember the time before, but the living know only the time after. In the next chapter, we trace how memory transforms into myth and religion, how the Anunnaki become gods, demons, and eventually theological abstractions, asking what is preserved and what is lost in each transformation. Memory is clay in the hands of time, shaped and reshaped by each generation that inherits it. The Anunnaki, once named and specific in Sumerian texts, become the Babylonian pantheon, Marduk, Ishtar, Ea, their stories elaborated, their roles adjusted to reflect new political realities. When the Greeks encounter Mesopotamian culture, they translate the gods into their own terms, identifying Ishtar with Aphrodite, Nergal with Ares, until the original names fade and the Greek versions dominate. The Romans adopt the Greek gods, renaming them again, and by the time Christianity spreads across the Mediterranean, the old gods are reinterpreted as demons, fallen angels, or allegories, their temples repurposed or destroyed, their myths preserved only as literature or cautionary tales. The Watchers, revered in early Jewish mysticism, become figures of evil in later Christian demonology. Their names invoked in exorcisms, their teachings framed as forbidden and corrupting. The transformation is gradual but total. What begins as history, or at least claimed history, becomes myth, then religion, then folklore, each layer adding interpretation and subtracting detail. What remains? A pattern, a structure, an echo of something that once had substance. The shift from polytheism to monotheism accelerates the abstraction. In the Hebrew Bible, the Anunnaki and Watchers are remnants, traces of older stories that no longer fit the theological framework. Genesis 6, with its cryptic mention of sons of God and Nephilim, is left unexplained, a fragment of pre-Israelite mythology that the editors could not entirely erase. The Book of Enoch, which elaborates the Watcher's story, is excluded from the Hebrew canon, preserved only by Ethiopian Christians and in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The gods of Canaan, Baal, Asherah, El, are demonized or absorbed into the singular God of Israel, their plurality collapsed into unity. By the time of the prophets, the existence of other gods is denied entirely, and the old stories are reframed as tests of faith or warnings against idolatry. Yet the structures persist. Angels, once distinct entities with names and roles, become messengers of the one God. The heavenly council, the assembly of gods described in Psalm 82 and elsewhere, is reinterpreted as angels or metaphor. The memory of plurality is smoothed into singularity, but the seams still show. In the Islamic tradition, the jinn occupy a space analogous to the Anunnaki or Watchers, beings created from smokeless fire, capable of good and evil, interacting with humanity but separate from it. Some jinn, like Iblis, the Islamic equivalent of Satan, rebel against God's command to honor humanity. Others serve as intermediaries, teachers, or companions to prophets and saints. The Quran mentions Harut and Marut, two angels who descended to Babylon and taught humanity magic, a story that echoes the Watchers' descent and their transmission of forbidden knowledge. The Islamic cosmology preserves a layered universe, jinn, angels, humans, each with distinct natures and roles, a structure more reminiscent of polytheistic systems than strict monotheism. Yet the jinn are not gods. They are creatures subject to divine law, and their power, though great, is limited. The transformation is complete. The sky beings are no longer rulers or teachers but subordinate entities, fascinating but ultimately irrelevant to salvation. The modern rediscovery of Sumerian texts in the 19th century, when archaeologists like Henry Rawlinson and George Smith deciphered cuneiform, brought the Anunnaki back into view, not as gods but as historical curiosities. Scholars studied the tablets as windows into ancient culture, psychology, and politics, not as literal accounts. Then, in the 20th century, alternative interpretations emerged. Zecharia Sitchin, an independent researcher, proposed in his 1976 book, The 12th Planet, that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth from a planet called Nibiru, genetically engineered humanity to mine gold, and left after internal conflicts and natural disasters. Sitchin's translations and theories are widely rejected by mainstream scholars as mistranslations and speculative leaps, yet his work popularized the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the idea that myths of gods are actually accounts of alien contact. This framework, whether accurate or not, reintroduces the possibility that the Anunnaki were physical beings, not metaphors, and that their disappearance was a literal departure, not a cultural evolution. What do we lose and what do we preserve in each transformation? When the Anunnaki become gods, we lose their specificity, their technology, their physicality, but we preserve the pattern, the descent, the teaching, the judgment, the withdrawal. When gods become demons, we lose their benevolence but preserve their power and their danger. When myths become theology, we lose the narrative but preserve the moral framework, the sense that humanity is accountable to something greater, something that once intervened and may intervene again. When historical texts become ancient astronaut theories, we lose the cultural context but preserve the question, were we alone in our development, or were we guided, shaped, taught by others? None of these transformations is complete. Each leaves traces, threads that connect back to the original story, whatever that story was. The stones remember, and so do the texts, but the memory is refracted through millennia of interpretation. In the next chapter, we examine the modern rediscovery of these myths and the contemporary attempts to make sense of the Anunnaki and Watchers, asking which frameworks best honor both the evidence and the mystery. The 19th century was an age of excavation, literal and metaphorical, as archaeologists and linguists unearthed civilizations that had been lost for millennia. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, followed by Henry Rawlinson's breakthrough with cuneiform in the 1850s, opened windows into worlds that had been silent for over 2,000 years. Suddenly, Sumerian king lists, Akkadian epics, and Babylonian creation myths could be read, and what they revealed was startling. The Bible, long thought to be unique revelation, shared narrative structures with Mesopotamian texts. The flood story, the creation account, even legal codes like the Ten Commandments had parallels in earlier Sumerian and Akkadian sources. This sparked both crisis and opportunity. For traditionalists, it threatened the Bible's authority. For scholars, it revealed a shared ancient Near Eastern cultural milieu from which both biblical and Mesopotamian traditions emerged. The Anunnaki, named in these newly translated texts, became subjects of academic study, analyzed as mythological constructs reflecting the social and political structures of early Mesopotamian city-states. But for some, the texts raised a different question. What if they were not purely myth? In the mid-20th century, fringe theories began to emerge, fueled by a combination of genuine curiosity and dissatisfaction with purely symbolic interpretations. Erich von Daniken's 1968 book Chariots of the Gods popularized the idea that ancient monuments and myths reflected visits by extraterrestrial beings. He pointed to the precision of the pyramids, the Nazca lines in Peru, the Moai of Easter Island, and argued that primitive humans could not have created them without advanced assistance. Critics dismantled many of his claims, showing that human ingenuity, given time and organization, could account for these achievements, but the core question persisted. Von Daniken was followed by Zecharia Sitchin, whose Earth Chronicles series proposed a detailed narrative. The Anunnaki were aliens from Nibiru who genetically modified Homo erectus to create Homo sapiens as a labor force. Sitchin's work is controversial, his translations disputed, his astronomical claims about Nibiru debunked, yet his books sold millions of copies, tapping into a widespread intuition that the old myths might contain forgotten truths. Mainstream scholarship rejects the ancient astronaut hypothesis as pseudoscience, noting that it often relies on mistranslations, selective evidence, and a failure to understand the cultural and symbolic contexts of ancient texts. The Anunnaki, scholars insist, were gods in the conventional sense, personifications of natural forces, ancestors, or political powers, not aliens. The precision of ancient construction reflects human capability, not extraterrestrial engineering. The flood myths reflect local or regional inundations, remembered and mythologized, not a global cataclysm. This perspective is grounded in rigorous methodology, peer review, and a commitment to evidence-based conclusions. Yet it sometimes struggles to account for the anomalies, the advanced knowledge that appears suddenly, the global distribution of similar myths, the engineering feats that push the boundaries of what we expect from Bronze Age or Neolithic cultures. The debate is not settled, and perhaps cannot be, because the evidence is incomplete, the texts ambiguous, and the stakes, philosophical and theological, too high for dispassionate consensus. Another framework, less sensational but equally provocative, is the lost civilization hypothesis. Researchers like Graham Hancock propose that an advanced human civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, around 12,000 years ago, and was destroyed by catastrophic climate change or cosmic impact. Survivors of this civilization, carrying knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, and architecture, migrated to regions like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Andes, where they taught less developed populations and were remembered as gods or sky beings. This theory avoids the extraterrestrial element, grounding the Anunnaki and Watchers in human history, but it still challenges the mainstream narrative that civilization began abruptly around 4000 BC with Sumer. Evidence for a lost civilization remains contentious. Sites like Göbekli Tepe and underwater ruins are cited as support, but definitive proof, cities, texts, skeletons from this hypothetical culture, has not been found. The theory occupies a middle ground, more plausible than ancient astronauts to some, still speculative to others. What all these frameworks share is a recognition that the myths matter, that they are not random fantasies but structured narratives encoding something significant. Whether that something is psychological archetypes, cultural memory, historical events, or encounters with non-human intelligences, the myths demand engagement. To dismiss them as primitive superstition is to ignore the sophistication of the cultures that produced them, their astronomical knowledge, their literary artistry, their philosophical depth. The Anunnaki and Watchers, whatever they were, left marks deep enough that millennia later we are still trying to read them. The stones remember, and the texts preserve, but the interpretation remains open, contested, alive with possibility. In the final chapter, we gather all the threads, acknowledging the limits of our knowledge while honoring the enduring power of the question. Who were the sky beings, and what does their story, whether history or myth, reveal about humanities? We return to where we began, standing in the ruins of Eridu beneath a sky full of stars, asking the question that has haunted us through 12 chapters of evidence, interpretation, and mystery. Who were the Anunnaki, the Watchers, the sky beings remembered in myths across every continent and culture? Were they gods in the supernatural sense, transcendent powers beyond physical form? Were they advanced humans, survivors of a lost civilization displaced by catastrophe and remembered as divine? Were they visitors from elsewhere, whether other worlds or other dimensions, whose intervention jump-started human civilization and whose departure left us to continue alone? Or were they none of these, merely symbols, projections of human psychology onto the cosmos, archetypes that helped early cultures make sense of their origins and their place in the universe? The evidence does not allow certainty. The texts are ambiguous, the monuments open to multiple interpretations, the myths layered with centuries of retelling. Yet the pattern is undeniable. Something happened in the deep past, something significant enough that every subsequent culture felt compelled to remember it, to preserve it in stone and story, even as the details blurred and the original context faded. The stones remember. This has been our refrain, our anchor through the labyrinth of myth and archaeology. The megalithic sites, Göbekli Tepe, Giza, Tiwanaku, Baalbek, stand as testimony to knowledge and capability that appear suddenly in the historical record, fully formed without obvious developmental phases. The astronomical alignments encoded in their architecture suggest an understanding of celestial mechanics that required generations of observation, yet they seem to have no precursors. The flood myths, preserved in over 200 cultures, describe a cataclysm so total that it reset human civilization, dividing time into before and after. Geological evidence supports catastrophic sea level rise at the end of the Younger Dryas, around 9600 BC, inundating coastal regions and displacing populations. The myths insist this was not merely natural disaster but judgment, a deliberate act to cleanse the earth of corruption introduced by the sky beings and their hybrid offspring. Whether we interpret this as theological truth, distorted memory of climate catastrophe, or symbolic narrative of moral reckoning, the myths agree on the structure. The age of direct contact ended with water, and humanity emerged to rebuild without the teachers who had guided them. The knowledge left behind, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, writing, medicine, appears in the earliest texts as gifts from the gods, teachings from the Apkallu or Watchers, revealed wisdom rather than discovered science. Mainstream scholarship attributes this to the normal process of cultural development, trial and error accumulated over centuries, then codified once writing emerged. Yet the texts themselves resist this reading. They insist the knowledge came from outside, from heaven, from beings who descended and taught. The Sumerian King List places impossibly long-lived rulers before the flood, then plausible human lifespans after. The Book of Enoch describes Watchers teaching specific technologies, naming them, detailing their gifts and the corruption that followed. Egyptian tradition credits Thoth with writing and mathematics. Hindu texts speak of rishis who received the Vedas directly from cosmic consciousness. Every tradition has its version, and every version points upward, outward, to a source beyond ordinary human discovery. We can dismiss this as pious fiction, the ancients attributing their own achievements to gods for theological or political reasons. Or we can ask, what if they meant it literally? What if they were describing, in the only language and framework available to them, an encounter with intelligence not their own? The disappearance is as significant as the presence. The Anunnaki withdraw after the flood, their rule replaced by human kingship lowered again from heaven but in diminished form. The Watchers are bound in darkness, their offspring destroyed, their influence severed. The Apkallu are succeeded by human sages who channel rather than embody divine wisdom. Every tradition marks this transition, the age of gods giving way to the age of men. Why? If the sky beings were purely mythological, there is no reason for their departure to be so consistent across cultures. If they were metaphors for natural forces, those forces did not cease operating. If they were political constructs, later rulers would have continued to claim divine status. Yet the pattern shifts toward mediated authority, priests and prophets interpreting divine will rather than embodying it. The most parsimonious explanation, if we take the myths seriously, is that something real ended. Either a predecessor civilization collapsed, its survivors scattering and eventually blending into less developed populations, or external teachers, whatever their nature, withdrew, their mission complete or abandoned, leaving humanity to develop independently. The silence after the flood is profound, and in that silence, we find both loss and opportunity. Humanity, for better and worse, became responsible for its own trajectory. We may never know with certainty who the Anunnaki were, whether their stories are history, myth, or some fusion of both. The evidence is too fragmentary, the time too distant, the transformations of memory too complete. Yet the question remains vital, not because it will be definitively answered, but because it forces us to reconsider our assumptions about human origins, capability, and destiny. If we were guided, shaped, taught by others, then we are not the self-made species we imagine, and our development carries the imprint of hands not our own. If the myths are memory, then history is deeper and stranger than the textbooks allow, and the stones, the texts, the monuments are not relics of primitive superstition but archives of an age we have forgotten. The Anunnaki and Watchers, whether gods, ancestors, teachers, or symbols, remind us that our story is incomplete, that the past holds mysteries we have barely begun to explore, and that the cosmos may be more crowded, more interconnected, more alive with intelligence than our current frameworks admit. The stones remember what we have forgotten. The myths whisper what the silence conceals. And we, heirs to both the monuments and the mystery, stand at the threshold of remembering, if only we are willing to listen. If this journey through ancient texts, crumbling ruins, and the echoes of forgotten voices has stirred something in you, sparked curiosity, or simply given you a moment to wonder at the strangeness of our human story, I would be deeply grateful if you would hit the like button and subscribe to Whispered Empires. Your support allows me to continue exploring these mysteries that live in the borderlands between history and legend. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the Anunnaki and Watchers were real beings who once walked the earth? Or do you think they are powerful myths that reveal deeper truths about human nature and our place in the cosmos? Drop a comment and use the word remember so I know you listened all the way to the end. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight, for questioning, for imagining, and for honoring the voices that speak to us from the deep past. Until the next story, keep listening to the whispers of empires lost and found.